She appeared at the edge of my porch just as the sun bled out behind the pines, barefoot, shivering, and dusted with frost like she'd been carved out of the winter itself. She didn't say a word. She only opened her trembling hand, and inside it was my mother's ring, the one buried with her 10 years ago. I grew up on a quiet road where neighbors kept their distance and the winters were long enough to rearrange a person's faith. The girl next door, Mara Langley, vanished during the first storm of December, and our small town swallowed her absence with a mix of fear and resigned silence. I never expected to see her again, let alone on my doorstep at sunset, holding something that should have remained in the earth. That moment cracked open a season of questions I wasn't prepared to answer, in a town that didn't want them asked. The sun had already dipped behind the tree line when I saw her, just a thin line of fading orange caught in the ice on her hair, like someone had painted the world behind her and forgotten to color her. Mara Langley stood on my porch without knocking, barefoot, silent, her small shoulders trembling in a way that didn't match the rhythm of the cold. And for a long moment, I just watched her through the glass, watched her breath fog the air in slow, uneven pulses, wondering if she was even real, or just winter playing tricks on me again. I opened the door as gently as I could, but the hinges still made that low groan they always make in winter. She didn't flinch, didn't look up, she only let the darkness spill past her ankles into my house like she was delivering it. Her hair was wet at the ends, frozen in thin needles that clung to her cheek. I could see the pink rawness around her fingertips. The way she held her right hand close to her chest, like something precious or something she didn't trust the world with. Mara. I said her name quietly, the way you would if you were afraid of breaking the air. She didn't respond. A gust of wind pushed at her back then, and for a second I thought she might fall into me. But she didn't. She stood rooted to the boards, eyes unfocused, and shining like she'd been staring at something no one else could see. The porch light flickered once, it always does in winter. But somehow, the moment felt different this time, like the house was hesitating too. I placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the cold through her thin shirt. She was trembling, but it felt more like an echo than a response. "Come on," I murmured, "let's get you warm." She'll let me guide her inside. Small steps, stiff legs, the way someone moves after a long time without trusting the ground. The warmth from the space heater in the living room brushed against us, but she didn't seem to feel it. The door closed behind us with a heavy click, a sound that felt strangely final. I grabbed the thick wool blanket from the couch, draped it around her shoulders, and eased her onto the old armchair. The chair sighed under her weight, wood creaking like it remembered her from before. But she didn't look at me, not once. Her gaze stayed fixed somewhere past my left shoulder, somewhere that wasn't the room we were in, somewhere colder. It wasn't until I knelt down to her level that I noticed what she was holding. Her hand was balled tight, too tight, knuckles white, skin scraped raw around the edges. "Mara," I said softly, "you're hurt." Nothing, just that hollow stare and those slow breaths that didn't sound like they belonged to her. I touched her wrist gently, trying to coax her fingers open, thinking she might be holding on to a piece of wood, or a rock, or some scrap she clung to through fear. But when her hand loosened only slightly, I saw the glint. A small circle of gold. Old, worn, smooth. A tiny dent on the inner rim from when it caught on the drawer handle. Years ago, my mother's ring. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. It felt like the air in the room had folded itself in half. That ring had been buried with her. 10 years ago. In the cemetery 2 miles from here. Under soil that froze solid every winter and never gave anything back. Mara tightened her grip again, as if she sensed my reaction without ever lifting her eyes. I whispered, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer, didn't even shift in the chair. The space heater hummed in the corner, struggling against the cold that clung to her like a second skin. And I realized the room felt wrong, colder than it should have been, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. I rubbed my hands together, trying to make sense of the frostiness in the air. Winter didn't usually reach this deep into the house, but maybe she'd brought some of it in with her. Maybe it had followed her. I sat down on the edge of the coffee table, trying to meet her eyes. "Mara, can you hear me?" Her lashes flickered once, the tiniest movement, like she was waking from a dream she didn't want to return from, and then in a voice barely louder than a breath, "Where is she?" It was so soft I almost missed it. A scrape of sound, a word pulled through frost. "Who?" I asked gently. Her lips parted just slightly. She swallowed, a stiff, painful motion. Her eyes still didn't rise to mine. "Your mother." I felt something deep inside me shift. A quiet, cold movement, like ice cracking underfoot. "Mara," I said, leaning closer. My mother's gone. You know that. But Mara didn't respond. Not with confusion, not with grief, not with anything a child might feel, hearing those words. Her breath grew more uneven, shallow, the way someone breathes when they're lost somewhere, between fear and memory, and when her fingers finally loosened enough for the ring to drop into my palm. It was warm, warm. As if it had been worn. I stared at it, the weight of it sitting wrong in my hand. The gold felt different, too alive, like it carried someone's pulse. I looked back at her. Mara? Who gave this to you? Her chin trembled. For the first time, her eyes met mine. Wide, empty, frozen with something I couldn't name. She did. Just 2 words, but they hollowed the room. She told me to bring it back, Mara whispered. She said you'd understand. The house fell completely silent then. Even the space heater seemed to hold its breath. I sat there, the ring warm in my palm, the weight of it pressing harder than metal should. Mara curled her fingers into the blanket again, withdrawing into herself like a fading ember. Outside, the wind brushed against the house in slow, searching strokes. Inside, winter lingered in the corners like it had found a new home. I looked at the girl on my chair, barefoot, frostbitten, returned from nowhere, and knew nothing about this night was finished. Not the cold, not the ring, not the question hanging between us like a ghost. How could Mara come home with something buried in a grave she never touched? And more frightening, why did she speak of my mother as if she'd just seen her? The morning after Mara returned, the house felt different, quieter, as if the walls were listening for something they couldn't name. I stood in the kitchen with the ring in my hand, watching how the weak winter light slipped across its surface. It caught on the tiny scratches along the band, scratches I didn't remember, and for a moment, the world felt tilted, like I was seeing something that shouldn't have been found, something that had clawed its way back into the light. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I kept hearing Mara's voice, that thin, trembling whisper, asking where my mother was. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her on my porch again, her hand rigid around the ring, her breath fogging the air in quiet, uneven sighs dot by sunrise. The house had warmed a little, but my skin still held traces of the cold she brought in. I made coffee I couldn't taste. Pacing slow circles around the kitchen table, the ring sat in the center like it had claimed the space. An object out of time, out of place. A reminder that yesterday hadn't been a dream, no matter how much of it felt like one. When the old clock above the sink ticked past 7, I finally picked up the phone. My voice sounded strange when I spoke, tight around the edges. Sheriff, you need to come by. I didn't say anything else. Didn't have to. Mara was still asleep in the guest room, or something close to it. She lay curled on top of the blanket, not under it, as if she didn't trust warmth anymore. Her breathing was faint, almost fragile. I didn't wake her. I just closed the door quietly and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. There was a stillness to the house that made the floorboards feel softer beneath my feet. But the cold lingered. Even with the furnace running, the air had a sharp edge, like winter had left its fingerprints on the walls. The sheriff arrived a little after 8. He knocked twice, firm and steady, before stepping inside with a gust of cold air. He didn't waste time on small talk. Didn't look at the coffee or the mess on the counter. His eyes went straight to my hand. That it? He asked. I nodded and placed the ring in his palm. He turned it over once, studying it like he was afraid it might crumble. This your mother's? Yes. He let out a slow breath, thought it was buried with her. It was. That hung between us for a moment, not disbelief, but something heavier, something neither of us had the words for. He asked to see Mara next. I led him down the hall, each of us moving carefully, like sudden motion might startle whatever had settled over the house. When I opened the guest room door, she was sitting upright. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the corner of the ceiling as though following something only she could see. Mara, the sheriff said gently. She turned her head stiffly, like the movement cost her effort. But she didn't speak, didn't acknowledge him beyond that one glance. What's she holding? He asked. I hadn't noticed it before. Her hand was closed again, tight around something small. Not the ring this time. Something else. Sweetheart, the sheriff murmured, can you show me what's in your hand? But she pulled it closer to her chest, shaking her head once. Barely. He straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. Then he stepped to the side, motioning me toward the hallway. Out there, away from her ears, he lowered his voice. She needs a doctor, and someone should run tests. Hypothermia, trauma, maybe more. His tone was careful, but his eyes told the truth. He didn't know what he was looking at, and neither did I. At the hospital, everything felt too bright, too loud. The fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, the chatter of nurses moving past, it all clashed with the cold quiet Mara had carried with her. They took her into an exam room. The sheriff stayed to answer questions. I sat in the hallway, hands clasped, trying to keep my breathing steady. A nurse passed me, offering a small, sympathetic smile. It slid right off me. Minutes, maybe hours later, the sheriff returned. He had the ring in his hand again. "They're trying to talk to her," he said. "She only asks one thing." I swallowed. "What? Where your mother is?" That cold feeling crept up my spine again, as if the hospital's warmth had nothing to latch onto. "She keeps repeating it," he continued. "Quiet, like she's confused, or like she's looking for her." I took the ring back. The metal felt warmer now, just like last night, as if it had held someone's heat. The sheriff leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. "There's something else," he added. "Those scratches on the ring. Fresh." I stared at him. "Fresh." He nodded, like it was scraped against stone, or pulled from the ground. The air thickened around us. I tightened my grip on the ring until the band pressed into my skin. "Sheriff," I said quietly, "someone would have had to dig up her grave." He didn't answer, didn't look at me. He just exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale a man makes when he's trying very hard not to imagine something. Before either of us could say more, the doctor approached. "Are you family?" she asked me. "No," I said. "Just someone she trusts." The doctor hesitated, glancing back at Mara's room. "She's stable, but frightened. She keeps clutching something and won't let us take it." "What is it?" I asked. "A piece of metal," the doctor said. "Looks old, like it's been buried a long time." My grip on the ring tightened. I didn't trust myself to speak. That evening, when they let me in to see her, she was staring out the hospital window. The sky was the color of fading ash, soft and dim. "Mara," I whispered. She didn't look at me, but her hand opened just slightly, showing the glint of rusted metal resting in her palm. Something thin, something sharp, something that looked like it belonged deeper in the earth than any ring ever had. I stood there, the ring warm in my pocket, the cold rising around us again, and for the first time since she'd appeared on my porch, I felt the question settle heavy in my chest, the same one she had carried all morning. If Mara brought these things back, then who put them in her hands? The woods behind my house are louder in winter, not with birds, but with the absence of sound. Snow hushes everything, presses it flat, and the trees stand like dark teeth against the pale sky. When the sheriff asked me to come look, he led me along the narrow service road that runs between the pines. My boots sank into fresh powder. Each step made a small, soft complaint. We reached the clearing where the footprints began. There was only one line at first, small, deliberate prints heading into the trees as if someone had walked in with purpose and never intended to return. They started at the edge of the road and stopped at a place where the snow was flattened, circular, and weirdly clean. No trail out. I felt the cold differently here, not the thin house cold that creeps through windows, but a deep, patient cold that seemed to have been waiting for us. The sheriff crouched beside the prints, tracing a finger near the edges but never touching them. He spoke softly, the way people do when they're aware of sacred things. "They're small," he said. "A child." That knowledge should have carried relief. Instead, it tightened my chest. I knew the size of Mara's feet. I knew how she ran across my lawn all summer with a squeal and a trail of sunburnt hair. These prints matched that memory and didn't match it, as if they were made by two different versions of the same girl. I knelt down. The snow smelled like nothing, clean and flat, and the prints were almost too neat, spaced at a steady pace. No scuffle, no shuffle, no desperate drag of a toe. Whoever made them walked as if they were following a map in their head. The flattened circle in the trees bothered me the most. It looked as if someone had sat down and been very careful to leave no mess behind. No broken branches, no fallen pine cones, just a calm patch of trampled snow. Like a paused breath, I swallowed. "You sure there's no other set?" I asked. The sheriff shook his head. "We scoured for anything else." "Nothing." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small camera, snapping pictures with the clinical calm of someone cataloging evidence. He kept glancing at me like he expected me to make sense of it. I wanted to. I wanted to find the shape of the answer in those prints and hold it like a warm thing. But the snow gives up its secrets slowly, if at all. As the day slid toward noon, a thin sun fought through the gray and made the prints cast long, blue shadows. A neighbor from up the road joined us, an older man who liked to sit on his porch and watch the town's quiet unravel. He stared at the circle and said, without being asked, "I heard a kid crying down there last month. Thought it was coyotes." That line landed heavy. Not because it was surprising, but because it made the day before feel less like a miracle, and more like a continuation of something that had been happening for a while. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He looked to me. "You say she left your porch last night?" I nodded. I told him about the ring, the way Mara hadn't seemed right, the bedside silence that felt like a held breath. He considered that against the prints, as if trying to make the two fit on the same page. We followed the prints a little deeper, stepping carefully around saplings and fallen needles. The snow here was at hip height, and our shins shoved through it with each slow step. The trees closed in, and sound thinned to a single, sustained note, my own breath and the whisper of our movement. At one point, the prints veered slightly, following an old game trail that I'd used as a kid to sneak down to the frozen creek. I remembered the way light fractured there, how the ice on the surface glittered like glass. The trail ended at the creek bank, where the footprints stopped at the thin, fragile edge of the ice. No prints on the frozen water, no sign of someone crossing, just a line that faded as if swallowed by the air itself. It was there by the creek that we found something else, half buried in a drift, a small scrap of fabric, the kind of ribbon Mara always tied in her hair. It was dingy, rimed with frost, and the fibers were clotted with something that made my stomach drop. Not blood, not exactly. It looked like soil, dark, sticky, like the earth had been clotted onto the ribbon and then frozen. I picked it up with gloved hands because there was no other way to hold something that had been under the trees for unknown days. The texture was wrong for snow. It felt like the ribbon had been pressed against something damp and then left to harden. The sheriff crouched beside me, and for a moment we were two men muttering around a small relic, like boys in a schoolyard finding a coin with a face worn away. But this coin carried the scent of ground and cold and an activity I didn't want to reckon with. "You sure she was not here the whole time?" the sheriff asked softly. "Maybe someone was watching and brought her out." I thought of Mara, curled on my chair, asking for my mother. The memory made me ache. "She came back to my porch," I said. "She wasn't here before." He didn't argue. He only tapped his glove against the ribbon and said, "This should be tested." The ribbon felt suddenly like proof, evidence that Mara had been in this place, that she had touched something not meant to be touched. But it also raised a colder possibility. What if she wasn't the only one who had been here? What if someone or something had been moving around in the dark places of the woods, collecting small things like bones and ribbons and rings? A wind came through then, thin and sharp, and it carried a sound, not a voice. Exactly, but a pattern of noise that made the hair on my arms stand up. For a second, it sounded like a soft, distant humming. I imagined Mara there, in that circle, hearing something in the trees and following it like a trail of breadcrumbs. The notion felt wrong and inevitable at the same time. We stood for a long while, the three of us, until the daylight thinned into a hard blue dusk. The sheriff took pictures of the prints and collected the ribbon in a paper bag like someone handling a relic. He promised to send it to the lab, to comb the woods again, to do the things one does when facing a problem with no name. As we left, I looked back at the flattened circle. It had settled into the snow, a small, quiet wound on the landscape. The trees seemed to lean over it protectively, or perhaps possessively. That night, I washed the ribbon under the kitchen tap because I couldn't leave it where it was. The water loosened the dirt in thin shreds. The ribbon bled a smell I couldn't place, not quite like earth, not quite like decay. My hands trembled even under the steady flow of warm water. I wrapped the cleaned ribbon in a paper towel and placed it on the table beside my coffee mug. The ring in my pocket felt heavier than it had that morning. Two small things, a ribbon and a band of gold, sat on my kitchen table like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence I didn't understand. Outside, a wind moved through the pines again, and I imagined footprints being made in the snow somewhere far from the road. I lay awake that night listening for them, but all I heard was the slow, patient creak of the house settling into winter. The hospital smelled like clean things trying not to remember. Fluorescent lights hummed like distant insects. The window in Mara's room framed a strip of winter sky, thin and pale as an old photograph. Mara sat on the vinyl chair with her knees pulled up, looking out through the glass as if the trees beyond were a film she'd been paused inside. She wasn't watching the sky, she was listening to it. I'd never liked hospitals much. They make everything feel provisional, like people are held together by tape until the glue runs out. But that room was smaller than I expected, too small for the kind of silence that had come with Mara. When I opened the door, the nurse looked at me with that practiced softness strangers give when grief might be present but they're not allowed to name it. Mara didn't turn. Her hair had a rim of frost on it still, as if night hadn't finished with her. The blanket over her shoulders was hospital issue, thin and rough, and it didn't keep the cold out. She held something in her lap, a bit of metal wrapped in a scrap of cloth, and she kept worrying at the edge of it with thumb and forefinger like it might slide away. The light from the window laid long bars across her hands, turning them into maps of shadow and bone. "Hi," I said, because that felt like the best we had. Small words. No explanations. She didn't look at me. She watched some point past my shoulder, some place where the room stopped existing. The way she breathed suggested she was near something she'd lost. And the rest of the room was only an echo. The doctor came and went like weather, leaving behind clipped sentences and a clipboard that told the world what the machines could not. They ran tests, blood x-rays, questions that felt like checks against a list. Where were you? What did you do? Who was with you? Mara answered them the way someone repeats words they've been taught. Neat, neutral, detached. Between the tests, she said small things that didn't fit together. The tunnel was warm, she told me once, like a fact from a book. They said we should bring back what we find. She kept twisting the metal in her hand. I asked her what it was. She showed me a flattened shard, not unlike a pendant, rusted at the edges. Its surface scored with thin lines that might have been letters. Once, it smelled faintly of earth and the kind of water that sits under stones. "Where did you get this?" I asked. My voice sounded too loud in the sterile room. She looked at me then, really looked. For a second, the room narrowed to two faces and the window that separated us from the rest of the world. Her eyes were bright and small, like a lamp under frost. "Down there," she said. "It was waiting." The nurse wrote notes on a pad and pretended not to lean in. The doctor made motions with his hands like he was trying to box the problem into a shape he could carry down the hall. But Mara's sentences kept spilling out of the corners of the neat list they tried to make. "She told me to bring it. She said it had to go back." When I told the doctor about the ring, he frowned the way adults do when myth and medicine touch. "People misremember," he suggested. "Trauma can make the mind stitch things together." Maybe. But trauma doesn't explain the soil under the ribbon or the way the ring had been warm in my palm. It doesn't explain the way Mara's voice tightened on the word she. Like speaking it might call something back through the window glass. At one point, Mara reached up and pressed her forehead to the cool pane as if to listen to the trees. She whispered, "She's quiet right now." And then, to me, "She's sleeping." I didn't know whether to ask who she meant. Late in the afternoon, the light softened and leaned into the room, drawing the shadows long and patient. Mara's hands stopped their motion. She sat very still, as if holding her breath for someone else. Her lips moved with words I couldn't catch. "A private counting." Then she turned to me and said, plainly, "She remembers you." The sentence folded the room in half. My throat went dry. The television above the nurse's station muttered on without context. The doctor, passing down the corridor, froze mid-step like a photograph left open. "Mara," I said very carefully, "who remembers me?" She touched the place where my mother's ring had been, palm to palm, as if feeling her through the metal. "She told me you cried when they lowered her," Mara said. "She told me not to be scared." I felt something like grief and anger and a tired relief that I couldn't name press against my ribs. My mother had been buried with a small stone in her hands, the priest's words still in the margins of the program. 10 years. It was a neat, tidy ending we'd all agreed to keep. Mara's words unraveled that neatness. She spoke of a voice that had taught her to find things by listening to the quiet between trees. She described a shape in the tunnel that crouched and offered objects back to the cold. She said it like a child reciting the rules of a game. "Why did she give it to you?" I asked, my voice thin. Mara's gaze slid back to the window. "She wanted it to go home," she said. "She said it belonged to where she belonged." The doctors said little then. They wrote it down, nodded, and placed words like delirium and post-traumatic reaction in the space where I wanted explanation. They offered to keep her for observation. They suggested a counselor once she was stable. They treated the thing with lids and labels the way one hushes a room where crying might start. But Mara sat there, everything small and contained, and said with the clean, terrible clarity of a child, "She asked me to return it to you." My hands closed around the little shard in her palm, as if to test the truth of it. It was cold at the edges, warmed where she had held it. The hospital light made the rust look like a map of something buried and waiting. When the corridor lights dimmed for the night, a nurse draped a blanket over the chair and told us to rest. Mara fell asleep with her face against her knees, breath shallow and even. The city beyond the window seemed to hold its breath too. Every parking lot a pool of quiet. I sat in the chair opposite, the window painting my face in pale squares. The ring in my pocket felt heavier than the gold it was. The metal in Mara's hand had the dusky scent of a place that kept time differently. Outside, wind moved the bare branches of the trees. They tapped like fingers against the glass. A code I couldn't read. Inside, the room kept its small litness, a temporary harbor for a weather that had come through a child and left. Prints everywhere. I pressed my forehead to the cool of the window, the glass separating me from the trees and, for a moment, from the thing that had decided to remember. In the reflection, my mother's face would not appear, only my own and the shadow of a girl sleeping beside an empty bed. She remembers you, Mara had said. The words settled into the room like the first flakes of a new storm. The cemetery is a different country in winter, all soft edges and white absolutes. I walked the path with my boots cutting small, temporary highways through the snow. The stone of my mother's marker had a frosting of ice on its top, letters softened by weather and time. I expected neatness. I expected the small, respectful disturbances that come with seasons. What I didn't expect was the ground to look like something had been breathing under it, a thin crescent where the snow lay shallow and the soil showed dark through the white dot. My mother's grave was the place we had agreed on answers. 10 years had wrapped around it like a quiet blanket. The funeral, the stew of visitors, the flowers that sank and matted into the dirt. We'd put the ring onto her hand because it felt like closing a sentence. You bury things to stop asking. That's the part everyone says. I stood with my hands in my coat pockets and listened to the small noises winter makes. A crow. The distant rattle of a passing truck. The creak of the old iron gate. The air tasted like metal and old stories. My throat felt thick, like I was carrying an extra sound I couldn't let out. When you visit a grave in the cold, you bring your past, wrapped tight. I had rehearsed what I would say to the stone, nothing dramatic, just a plain thing. I miss you. I miss the small, stubborn ways she kept the house in order. I missed the way she tied my scarf with 2 thumbs and a slow smile. But standing there with the disturbed earth before me, rehearsals fell apart like old cloth. The neatness of 10 years unspooled into a question that had teeth. I stepped closer because that's what you do when the world hands you a thing you don't understand. You examine it. The crescent of disturbed snow led directly to where her name was carved. The snow around it had been brushed away. Not clumsily but with intention, the kind of careful touch someone uses when they mean to leave something as it should be. But there were smudges in the dirt, like the marks of fingers dragged through soil. My palms prickled. I crouched, the cold biting through my knees. The soil was softer than it should have been. The frost beneath it had been broken. It had been turned recently. If you've shoveled for a living, you learn to read the ground. This read like a hand that had worked slowly, maybe clumsy, maybe hurried, but with aim. I thought of what the sheriff said about fresh scratches on the ring. I thought of the ribbon found in the woods. I thought of Mara's small, unblinking face at my doorstep, questions stacked like plates. Who and why? And what could be taken from beneath our feet and returned to the surface like a mistake? I pulled my glove off a little and let my fingertips touch the earth. It was damp and cold and smelled like something out of season. The smell of soil that has been moved. The smell of what waits below. A ribbon of hair caught on the clump, thin and pale, and when I eased it free, my heart lurched because I knew that color. It was Mara's ribbon. The sound of gravel crunching announced the sheriff's car before I saw it. He climbed out, boots thudding, hands shoved into his pockets in a way that tried to keep the cold out but also kept his composure in. He looked at the disturbed ground and didn't seem surprised, only more serious. Like finding a new problem that fits into a pattern he'd been trying to ignore. Someone's been here, I said. My voice sounded small in the open air. He didn't answer right away. He knelt beside me, running a gloved thumb along a line of soil. We'll put up a perimeter, he said. We'll look for prints. We'll call the coroner, just to be sure. His words were efficient, the kind of language meant to arrange things so they stopped being mysterious. But the cold kept pressing at the back of my neck, the way a thought keeps returning until you give it a name. The coroner arrived with a quiet that never embarrasses itself with theatrics. He worked with gloved hands and a little LED lamp that made everything sharp and small. He eased the topsoil back carefully, like unwrapping a fragile thing. I watched, standing too close and too far at once. When he reached the coffin lid, he paused, just the briefest hitch of a man who is used to holding evidence and still sometimes has to accept surprises. He tapped the wood with the tip of a gloved finger, listening like someone hears echoes. Then he carefully opened the lid. The sight of my mother was the same and not the same. The skin, a pale map of time. The hair, the same curl she used to burn on the stove. She looked like sleep. The priest's words had been soft and final once, But now that finality had an edge I hadn't expected. I felt the ring in my coat pocket like a pulse. I took it out because my hands moved before my thoughts did. The coroner looked at it and then at Mara's grave, which lay open and raw. He used a little brush and swept the inside of the coffin with an almost gentle rhythm. The air smelled of dust and chemicals and something older. The scent of a place that keeps its secrets well. He found nothing else in the coffin. No sign of disturbance on her bones. No hint that someone had dug beneath and extracted something tangible. The soil inside the lid was neat and unremarkable. He closed it again with a slow care. Someone disturbed the grave and didn't take anything from here tonight, he said finally. If anything, they left traces. Traces. The word felt like a small, inadequate thing in my mouth. Traces of what? Of hands? Of a visitor who came to give and not to rob? Or of someone who tried to pull a story up through the roots and couldn't quite finish the sentence? I watched the coroner's gloved hands fold the dirt back into the place where she lay. The snow swallowed the marks, and the cemetery took on its ordinary, patient face. But I had seen the line of work done. I had seen the inside of the box. And the question that had arrived at my door with Mara, who would bring a ring back from a grave, had grown another limb, who would touch a grave and leave something as if they had borrowed time. Night came early, as it does in winter, rolling over the stones like a dark cloth. I traced the letters of my mother's name with the edge of my glove, as if touching them would make them tell me something. Around us, other graves huddled like quiet witnesses. The sheriff had set a lamp and left one of his men to sit in the car with the engine ticking. A small promise of watchfulness. I folded the ribbon Mara had brought into my palm and felt the thrum of it against my skin. The ring weighed heavier there, too, as if the metal wanted to be back where it had started. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices. I placed the ribbon gently on the stone because I couldn't think where else to put it. Before I left, I stood a moment longer and listened. The world had rearranged itself by a fraction. Nothing dramatic. Not yet, but enough that the ordinary lines of the town felt rubbed with new grief. I walked back to my car in a slow, careful arc, the snow swallowing my footprints like a patient thing. On the drive home, the road glowed in the headlights, and the ring in my pocket kept its small, impossible weight. The thought that chased me like a second shadow was simple and terrible. Someone had been here, close enough to touch what we thought was final, and they had either given something back or taken something deeper. The Langley house smelled like old bread and closed curtains. It sat 2 doors down with its porch light off, a squat shadow in the pale afternoon. When I stepped onto their sagging stoop, the world felt smaller, as if the town had folded itself away from that house and left the front yard to keep watch. Mrs. Langley opened the door before I could knock. She wore a cardigan buttoned to the throat and a face like a handwritten note, familiar, slightly trembling. Her eyes moved past me into the hallway and landed on the ring I kept in my palm. For a strange moment, she didn't see me at all. They'd always been quiet neighbors. Friendly in the way people with long memories and little need for gossip are, nods across the fence, casseroles at the holidays, polite hellos at the mailbox. Their house had the lived-in look of things that never moved. A chipped mug on the counter. A stack of gardening gloves by the back door. The dent in the banister where a child had bumped it 100 times. Inside, the air was still and warm and the way of a place kept shut against more winters than one remembers. The wallpaper had a small floral print that looked like it had been chosen on purpose to quiet a room. I felt like an intruder, though they invited me in. Mara's father hovered at the doorway with his hands in his pockets, eyes down like someone waiting for bad news to arrive in an envelope. Mrs. Langley's smile was thin and automatic. Made for visits and not for the kind of questions that had been following us around. They showed me Mara's room because it's the thing people ask to see when they want to measure where a child has been. The small bed, the bookshelf with mismatched spines, the poster pinpricked into the wall. Everything looked as if someone might walk back in and pick up where they left off. Pajamas folded on the chair, a stuffed fox propped against the pillow. That neatness felt both comforting and wrong. It was the kind of stillness that can be an oasis or a trap. Mrs. Langley fussed with the blanket as she talked, a nervous rhythm of fingers smoothing fabric. She was such a quiet girl, she said, and it landed like something she'd been rehearsing. Always careful. Her voice carried an undertow of disbelief. Her husband kept glancing toward the closet, like the door itself might cough up an answer. I told them about the porch and the ring, and the way Mara had come to me like a small, lost thing. They listened until the plate of their faces hardened, not with suspicion, but with a slow, widening grief. They told me they'd heard knocking in the walls after she disappeared. Night sounds that meant nothing in daytime but turned monstrous in the dark. They had assumed mice. They had assumed time. They had assumed 100 small excuses. It felt like their assumptions had been a kind of armor that didn't hold. Mara's father led me to the closet because his hand had started shaking and he wanted someone else to hold the shaking. The closet door was the same pale wood as the rest of the house, but the inside edge had scratches, thin, frantic lines scored into the paint. They were at the height of a child and went in a small cluster, like someone had been trying to get out, or to get someone else's attention. The air around them smelled faintly of cedar and something metallic, the scent of things that have been shut away too long. I ran my gloved finger across one of the marks and felt the ridge of dried paint. It wasn't old damage. It looked as if it had been made recently, then repainted over in the haste of parents who want to erase the sight of frantic hands. Mrs. Langley moved faster than before then, digging into a box on the top shelf and producing a thin, scuffed journal. Her hands trembled when she handed it to me. Pages fluttered as if they wanted to escape. Inside, Mara had written small notes, the kind of fragmentary scribbles children leave when they are keeping a secret or practicing to be older. Dates slipped like pebbles through the margins, nothing continuous, just marks. November 3rd, I like the dark. November 12th, they whisper. A line later, she told me to take it back. The handwriting was childish and precise. The letters neat but oddly patient. I felt the room close around that sentence. The Langleys watched me with an expression I knew too well. The slow collapsing into the knowledge that a thing you have defended is thin and porous after all. Mrs. Langley's voice came out small. We thought she was just telling stories. Kids talk about monsters. She looked at me as if asking for permission to keep believing that. Her husband, who had not spoken much, finally said, we checked the yard. Tore up the shrubs. Thought she might have been hiding, playing with friends? There were times we heard her in the night, moving about. But by morning, we'd say it's nothing. We'd close our eyes. They told me about the nights that followed her disappearance. The knocks, returning, sometimes 3 soft thumps, that sounded almost like footsteps walking along the walls. They said their dog wouldn't sleep near the closet. They described a small, repeating sound like someone counting in a language they couldn't place. The details stacked into a rhythm that began to feel like evidence rather than fear. Then Mrs. Langley stopped, her face folding into itself. She said, there's something else. She went to a dresser drawer and pulled out a small paper bag. Inside was a ribbon, one of Mara's, frayed and dirty. It was the color of old cream and smelled faintly of soil. They told me they found it washed in the sink one morning, soaked and smelling of the woods. But the water had drained away without leaving any explanation. As she handed it to me, the room went very quiet. You could hear the house settling, but, otherwise, it felt like the air had thinned to the size of that scrap. I thought of the ribbon we found in the creek, the one that smelled of earth and something else. This one was different, softer, like it had been handled with care. Mara's father, for the first time, sat down heavily on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were dry and furious all at once. We thought if she was frightened, she'd come to us, he said. His voice broke. We never expected her to leave and bring someone else's things home. The Langleys had tried everything they could think of, neighborhood watches, scolding, grounding, even prayers, said softly in the living room at night. Nothing had kept the knocking from finding them. And now, holding that ribbon and seeing the scratches, something shifted in the space between hope and resignation. It was as if their quiet life had been breached and the breach left a gift. A riddle wrapped in kindness that neither of them wanted or understood. Mrs. Langley pressed her palms together and said, if someone took her, why would they bring a ring? Why would they give it back? Her voice trembled on the last word like a child testing a forbidden door. The question landed on me and stayed, heavier than anything we'd spoken so far. We left the room with the closet door closed and the journal tucked under my arm like contraband. Outside, the late light had thinned to a cold lavender. The Langleys walked me to the door and stood on the porch for a few moments as if reluctant to let the day end. Mrs. Langley reached out and touched my sleeve in a small, accidental way that felt like a plea. On my walk back, the town seemed to hold its breath. The wood smoke felt like a veneer, thin and covering. In my pocket, Mara's ribbon and the ring pressed against my palm, 2 small relics that belonged to 2 different kinds of endings. I glanced back once. Through the window, Mara's bed looked small and ordinary, and yet the scratches in the closet said otherwise. The house had secret rhythms it didn't intend to share. When I slid the journal into my bag, a single page stuck. out a child's careful sentence that read, "She said bring back what's hers." The words trembled on the paper like a promise or a threat. I folded the page back into place and walked the few steps home with the thin air pulling at my collar. There was a softness outside. The kind that makes distant things look like memories already. I thought of Mara alone in that small room and of parents who kept their mouths shut because silence felt safer. I couldn't tell whether what had come through their walls was kind or cruel. All I knew was that something had been given back, and that would change what we chose to believe. There's a place behind the old water tower where the road narrows and the pines bend like a hallway. The entrance to the drainage tunnel is half hidden under a sagging iron grate, hairline frost collecting on the metal. When I crouched to look in, the air that came up smelled like ground that had been closed away, damp, dark, and patient. A flashlight in my hand made the shadows slow and deliberate. The beam found a curve of concrete and then was swallowed. It felt, for an instant, like the world had a mouth and had just closed it. I hadn't intended to come alone. But questions push you into places you don't plan on going, and the car keys were warm in my pocket all morning like an invitation. The tunnel had been town lore, something we told strangers in harmless tones when they asked about bad weather. Kids dared each other to crawl to the middle and swear they'd heard music. Adults spoke of it as one of those municipal mistakes, built in a rush, forgotten, then left to collect leaves and secrets. The sheriff had mentioned it in passing, a place that could hide a lot and be forgiven for it. The retired worker who'd finally said he'd heard a child down there had pointed me toward the iron grate with a finger that trembled as if remembering a song. That memory had been enough. The first step inside made the light look wrong. My beam cut a thin path but carried shadows behind it that didn't want to follow. Water dripped in a steady, indifferent rhythm. My boots echoed against the concrete like a metronome. I felt the cold differently here, not the clean bite of winter, but the damp press of a place that keeps its own small weather. Every sound I made seemed to travel further than I expected. The tunnel holds echoes like a jar holds coins. They clink back at you, but they're not the same coins you dropped. A smell rose from the floor. Iron, something sweet and loamy, the smell of things that have sat a long time and thought. My hands thumbed the ring in my pocket as if the metal would answer a question for me. I moved deeper, slow, careful. The tunnel's curve kept a mouth out of sight so that outside light faded like memory. On the concrete walls, someone, maybe many someones over many winters, had left marks, initials carved by board boys. The scattered paint of passing graffiti, a smear that looked like someone had laid a hand there and then dragged it down. I ran my fingertips along the smear and felt grit under my skin. Halfway in, the floor changed from dry concrete to a thin stretch of silt. My boots sank a fraction and came up layered in black. A scrap of fabric caught on a bolt, the right color, the cream of Mara's ribbon, though this one was darker, weighted with something that tasted of soil and old water. I fished it free and folded it into my glove because it felt wrong to let the wind touch it. Somewhere further on, my flashlight picked up a line of small impressions in the silt. They were shallow and careful, the shape of small feet stepping in a straight rhythm. They led into a side alcove and stopped. The arrangement looked like someone had sat down, folded their knees, and then been very careful not to leave more than a whisper of their passing. I crouched and touched one of the prints. It was warm, in a way that made my skin prickle, not warm like being alive, but warm as if the place had held a heat and released it slowly. The tunnel felt less like a hole, and more like a room with a memory. There were other things, a small coin, green with age, a threadbare button, a strip of something metallic, bent half into a crescent. Each item looked like it had been placed rather than dropped, arranged with a kind of patient intent. It felt like someone had been cataloging small things in a corner of the world, and then leaving them on a shelf of cold concrete. A sound came then, not behind me, but from deeper in the curve. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone counting on their knuckles. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo the way my boot did. It was close, intimate, the kind of sound you hear when a person is alone with a small worry and wants to measure it. I called out, my voice, small, Mara. The name disappeared into the tunnel and came back thinner. No answer. The tapping ceased as if someone had listened and decided not to make themselves known. The silence that followed had weight. I rounded the bend and found a shallow pit framed by broken concrete. Inside it lay a small mound of earthly things, pulled leaves, a slick of mud, and at the center, something that caught the light in a way that made it look alive. A ring. Not my mother's ring. Another band, older, the kind of patina that takes years and weather to grow. It sat on a flap of sod as if someone had chosen to lay it there like a marker. I crouched, the air tasting like distant rain. The ring bore scratches that matched the pattern on the ring I held in my pocket. My pulse got thready and too loud. I thought of the coroner's careful hands, of the ribbon, of the prints that stopped as if someone had been told to wait. It felt like the tunnel had become a stage, and some practice had been conducted in the dark. On the far wall, there was a smear, not of dirt, but of something that could be hair. It hung in small ropes, like someone had run their fingers through it and then let it dry. The light caught in the strands, and for the first time, something, like understanding not complete and not kind, moved through me. The things gathered here weren't random. They had been selected, returned, or left. The tapping started again, softer, right behind me, and this time I didn't call out. A voice arrived with it, barely a sigh. Bring back what belongs. The speaker was small and young and had the flat, certain cadence of a child following instructions. My throat closed. The light in my hand felt stupid and thin. I turned slowly, expecting a child, a stray animal, a trick of my own loneliness. There was no one. Just a curve of concrete and the faint suggestion of a shape where the wall met the floor. Something like a shadow folding in on itself. The voice was gone. The tunnel kept its secrets. I left the tunnel with mud on my boots and a small, almost holy hush at the back of my throat. The cold outside felt sharper, as if the dark had taught it new edges. The ribbon in my glove was damp and smelled of earth. My jacket smelled faintly like the tunnel's patient breath. When I climbed back to the light, the world seemed too bright. The pines stood like witnesses and the road stretched out like a spine. I walked home slowly, each step leaving a record in the snow that would soon be swallowed. The ring in my pocket buzzed like a question against my hip. That night, I spread the things on my kitchen table, a coin, a button, the older ring, the ribbon. They looked like a small altar of found things, humble and accusing. I expected to feel comforted by having them together, some sense of order returned. Instead, I felt smaller, a child again at a grown-up's kitchen table, being told there were no simple answers. Under the hum of the refrigerator, I listened for that tapping. I didn't hear it, but I could still feel it in the bones of the house. The memory of small feet and patient hands and the idea that the world under our feet had a way of returning what it wanted back into our laps. When Mara started to speak more, it was like the house learning to remember a forgotten song. Her words came in small, careful pieces, soft as breath on a window. She would look past me, past the wallpaper, and describe sounds I couldn't hear. A humming in the roots, a whisper in the spaces between trees. One evening she sat at my kitchen table with her chin in her palms and said, plainly, "She sings when the ground is awake." The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples kept coming long after the voice stopped. 4 days after the tunnel, Mara's speech came and went, like weather. Some hours, she was a quiet child humming to herself. Other times, a thin cassette of sentences rewound and played in fragments. The doctors called it dissociation, or post-traumatic stress. The sheriff called it mysterious. I called it hers, something that arrived with her and seemed to belong to the spaces that had taken her. She began to draw in the afternoons, hunched over my kitchen table with pencils that left tiny black scars on the paper. The drawings were not pretty in any conventional way. They were maps of feeling, a long tube of dark concrete, a figure at the end with hair like a curtain. Tiny piles of things arranged like little altars. She labeled them in her small, precise hand tunnel. Her, bring back. The handwriting looked older than the letters deserved. When she spoke, there was always the sense she was reading from a ledger she'd been made to keep. She described the tunnel as warm and close, like the belly of an animal. She said there was a voice that guided her steps, not unkind, but firm. Sometimes she smiled mid-sentence like someone recalling a private kindness. Other times her face went blank, as if the memory had a seam and she'd felt the thread pull loose. We moved through days with a new routine. Tests at the hospital, visits from neighbors, slow dinners that tasted like the town's concern. Mara's parents came and went in a kind of loop, present but not entire, as if their grief had made them cautious about inhabiting any one moment. The ring stayed on my kitchen counter, a warm, impossible thing. It acted like a watch, knocking at the hours when the past wanted attention. One twilight, she asked to go outside. The sky had the tight, hollow blue of late afternoon, and the air bit into my cheeks. She walked with a small, deliberate gait, like someone following a line on the ground only she could see. We went to the edge of the yard where the pines begin and the light thins. The trees stood in rows like old soldiers, their trunks black against the snow. Mara, I said softly, what do you hear? She paused, hands tucked in her sleeves, and tilted her head the way a kid listens for a familiar truck's engine. It says names sometimes, she answered. It says my name and other names. Not loud. She crouched and put her palm flat to the frozen earth, as if feeling for a heartbeat. Her fingers went numb from the cold, but she didn't move them. She taught me the rhythm, she said. Tap 3, then 2, like knocking on a wall. I thought of the knocking the Langleys had heard, of the tapping in the tunnel, of the prints that stopped in the snow. The pattern stitched itself into an outline I didn't want to finish. What does the voice want? I asked. Mara looked up at me then, and for a moment the child I'd known returned. Bright, impatient, real. It wants things, she said simply. It wants its things. It remembers what belongs to it. The cold pressed at our jackets and our breath made small ghosts. She described the voices as if reciting a recipe, soft at first. Then it lists what it wants. Then it waits. Her jaw worked like she was tasting the syllables. It showed me where to step. She continued. It pointed where I should find them. It said, bring back what's hers. The phrase had the force of ritual. It sat in the mouth like a coin you keep turning over. I felt the town's neat answers time, coincidence, grief sliding away in favor of something older, quieter, and far less willing to be named. That night she woke me. She was at the foot of my bed, breathing fast, eyes wide and luminous. The house was the kind of still that listens. Outside, a wind moved the pines in soft hands. She gripped my wrist like an anchor and whispered, she sang to me tonight. The way she said it made my chest hurt. I sat up, the old mattress groaning as if remembering other nights. What did she sing? I asked. Mara's lips trembled. A name, a long name that sounded like the creek. She searched for the edges of the memory like someone combing through a drawer. She said it was sorry at first. Then she told me to be brave. She told me about a figure on the far end of the tunnel. Small, maybe not small, a posture more than a body. It had hair that fell like water, and when it stepped back, it left small things on the ground, a button, a coin, a thread. She kept them in a pile, Mara said, like offerings, like a place that remembers. Her voice was steady but distant. There was a correctness to her recounting, as if she were obliged to get the story right. She looked at me, and the light from the bedside lamp made her eyes glassy. She asked me to bring some back, she said. She said some things are lonely. I felt a sharp, fragile anger that I couldn't easily place. At whom? At the woman in the tunnel. At the tunnel itself. At the neat protocol of coroner and doctor and law that pretended to fold human oddities into tidy reports. I wanted to be angry with something solid. Instead I could only hold Mara's hand, and let the tiny bones in it press into my palm like a compass pointing to something I couldn't follow. Then, quieter, she added, she told me one thing, don't tell them everything. The sentence landed like a warning. If the voice asked for secrecy, then the small axe we'd found, a ribbon, a ring, prints in the snow might be only part of a conversation the town wasn't meant to hear. The next morning, I found one of the sheets she'd been drawing on folded and tucked under a mug as if hidden. On it, a new sketch, a circle of small objects with a line leading back to a figure at the center. In the margin, in Mara's tight handwriting, she'd written, she hums when it is night, she keeps a list. I smoothed the page with fingers that smelled faintly of pencil and winter. The house felt both too full and too empty, like a room waiting for someone to return who might walk in with mud on their shoes and a strange, ordinary thing in their hand. I put the drawing in my pocket and kept my eyes on the trees outside. The pines seemed to stand a little straighter, like sentries at a border I hadn't known we shared. In my chest, an old grief shifted, rearranging itself around the possibility that some endings aren't endings at all. Mara slept through the day, curled in a chair, fingers stained with graphite. When she woke she hummed under her breath, a tune I didn't know but recognized by the way it made the room small and private. I listened and tried to match the rhythm with my heartbeat. She had learned a language no one else in town spoke yet, a syntax of soil and objects, and the hush between tree trunks. And in that quiet, the story that had started with a ring and a return felt less like a single act and more like the beginning of a long, patient conversation. The second time the earth announced itself, it did it softly, a set of bare footprints crossing my yard just before dawn, like someone had walked through a memory. I found them because my kitchen light had gone on, and the floorboards hummed with the quiet nervousness of someone waiting. They circled my mother's grave and stopped, each print pressed with the deliberateness of a message. The last step pointed toward the trees, as if whoever had walked them wanted me to follow. For a moment I stood in the doorway and listened to the house hold its breath. Night had a different language now. It came with a vocabulary of small disturbances, a scrape on the porch, the slow shift of a shadow against the curtains, the whisper of someone trying not to wake the dead. I had not expected the world to be so insistently small, details piling up like unread letters on my table. I wrapped my coat tighter as I stepped outside. The air bit at the backs of my ears the way it always does that time of morning, but there was a weight to it I hadn't felt before. As if the town itself were carrying news in the bones of the street. My breath fogged and hung between the porch light and the gravestone. And for a moment I wondered whether I'd dreamt the footprints into being. The prints were fresh, bare footprints pressed into the rimed grass, toes splayed slightly as if the walker had been testing the ground. Whoever had made them had moved with care, not the rush of someone fleeing, but the patience of someone leaving a note in the snow. They traveled in a slow loop around the stone and stopped facing the tree line like a person taking inventory of a horizon. Down the road, a lone police cruiser idled with its engine ticking. The sheriff's flashlight bobbed as he walked toward me, his silhouette a steady, familiar shape. He didn't look surprised, only tired in the particular way of people who have learned to expect the improbable. "We found more prints up by the oak," he said without preface. "Came from the woods, came back here." I felt my chest tighten into a small animal under a rug. 2 disturbances in as many nights was a sequence, not an accident. The town's neat borders, what belonged to the living and what belonged to the dead, felt like parchment that could be rubbed away with persistence. We walked the line of footprints together, the sheriff with his light and me with my hands shoved deep in my pockets. The prints had a rhythm, 3 short steps, 2 long, then a pause. My mind kept replaying Mara's description of the knocking, 3 then 2. Like a metronome for things that move under stone. At the base of the tree, the snow showed signs of disturbance, soft mounds, the drag of a sleeve, a circle of compacted ground. I knelt and brushed at the snow with the side of my hand, revealing a small, flattened patch where the leaves had been pushed aside. There, half buried, lay a thin, pale thing, a scrap of paper, folded and damp. I unfolded it with fingers that didn't quite obey me. The handwriting was small and hurried, as if the writer was afraid of being overheard. The words were not a plea and not a map. It read, "She keeps lists. She forgets some." Below that, in a child's uneven letters, someone had added a name, my mother's name. The sheriff looked at me, his mouth a tight line. "You still think this is random?" he asked. He had the look of a man asking himself whether the town's rules still applied. The paper smelled faintly of earth and something older, like paper left in a pocket near a seed. We found more things in the circle. A button with a mother-of pearl sheen, 1 small silver bead, the corner of a photograph whose image had been washed away by snow and sun. Each item felt like a page torn from a life, collected and set down in a deliberate arrangement. The pattern of things felt like a language that, for now, only the person who laid them down could read. As we stood there, a neighbor came up the path blinking. He lived 3 houses down and kept to himself. He told us between breaths that his dog had refused to go outside at night, that it had stared at the tree line as if it knew a stranger. "Animals notice," he said. "They notice what we pretend not to." His voice had the flatness of a man trying to explain why the world had turned strange. The sheriff bagged the paper and the trinkets with a professional slowness that felt like prayer. He said he'd send them to the lab. He said he'd ask the coroner to look at the grave again. He said things people say to organize the world back into compartments. But his hands shook when he lit a cigarette, and the smoke made a small private cloud around us. When he asked me if I wanted to come into the station, I almost said no. I wanted to stay with the prince and the grave and the small, precise disturbance of the morning. Instead I followed him, boots leaving a fragile trail that the wind might erase in hours. The station smelled like coffee and old paper. The desk sergeant offered us a chair, like a person offering an apology. The sheriff closed the evidence bag in front of us and said, "We spoke to some of the older folks." He paused then, and the pause had a gravity I didn't like. There were whispers, long ago, about winter things, kids who went missing, things brought back. He folded his hands and looked at me hard. People covered it up. They called it superstition, said it would pass. I felt the ground tilt under me. The thought that our little town had threaded itself through the same dark pattern years ago, then chosen silence over answers, felt like a betrayal. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked. My voice sounded brittle. The sheriff's face was the face of a tired man who'd been keeping a secret and now had to weigh whether to share it. "Maybe because some secrets keep people safer," he said. "Or maybe because nobody wanted to see what happens when you look." He handed me a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping. A small photograph of a child and a headline about a disappearance decades back. The date was 26 years ago. The name was different. The pattern was the same. Footprints in the snow. Items returned. A child changed. The town had smoothed the edges then, had chosen forgetfulness as a remedy. Now forgetfulness had been interrupted by a ring and a girl who had come home. When I walked back to the cemetery that evening, the sky had the thinness of old linen. The prints were still there, because the wind hadn't yet chosen to erase them. I stood at the stone and pressed my palm to the cold marble where my mother's name lived. The metal in my pocket hummed faintly against my thigh. The ring like a small, guilty heart. I thought of the quiet before the first disturbance and how quickly quiet becomes something you can't trust. The town's decisions to whisper, to ignore, to hand grief neat packages had been interrupted. The interruptions left us with small, precise clues and the knowing that whatever had touched us wanted to be acknowledged. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the photocopied clipping, the sheriff's cigarette smoke still in my hair, and the ring warm in my hand. The house felt like a thing listening for a key. Outside, the trees kept their patient guard. Between the sky and the pines, the small, steady rhythm of knocking 3, and then 2, kept repeating in the hollows of my bones. The sheriff's office smelled like paper and the kind of cold that waits in file cabinets. He slid a thin stack of yellowed notebooks across the desk, and the light from the window cut them into hard lines. The top one was labeled in a child's block letters. Things I remembered. I touched the cover and felt the grain of the paper, as if that texture could tell me what the ink had swallowed. Outside, the pines tapped at the window like someone counting. Inside, the past sat folded and patient on the table between us. He had been reluctant to bring them to me, the sheriff, who wears reserve like a winter coat. When he finally opened the drawer and handed over a notebook, his fingers trembled the way hands tremble when they are releasing something they've held too long. "You asked for anything old," he said. These belonged to him. Him was a boy who had disappeared 26 years ago. Name in the clipping, Thomas Avery. The town had buried the story then, like you bury an argument you don't want to have again. The notebooks were thin things filled with cramped, patient handwriting. On the first page, a small face had been drawn in pencil, eyes filled in like someone trying to keep a memory from leaking. I read until my throat felt raw. His notes were a child's log of odd comforts and arrangements, lists of things the voice liked, hours when it hummed, scraps of instructions in spiky pen. There were sketches of tunnels and circles of objects, neat arrows showing how to place offerings. There were entries that read like confessions. I took the coin back because she asked. I left my pop bottle. She said not to tell. The pages were both mundane and dreadful. They contained the slow building of a private language between a child and whatever listened to him. In the margins, past the careful handwriting, were adult scrawlings, notes from therapists, and the sheriff from years later. The kind of tidy translations people make when they want to colonize a fear with words. But the handwriting underneath kept sticking to the same pattern. Things taken, things returned. A rhythm of loss and compensation. I felt that cold thing in my chest again. The knowledge that we had been keeping company with this for decades and chose to name it superstition rather than hazard. I felt like the neighbor who watches their house from the window and never once thinks to close the door. The more I read, the clearer a pattern became. Thomas wrote about winter as a season that kept accounts. It wants what belongs, one entry said. It remembers hands. He described going down into the tunnel sometimes with a list of things he thought the cold had taken. He wrote about finding a ring, not his ring, but someone's, and carrying it home, because she said, "Bring it back, it's lonely." He drew circles of coins and buttons and labeled them with names of people in town, as if the town itself were a ledger and children were the clerks. The sheriff watched me carefully. "We covered it up," he said finally, the words leaving him like a confession. "Back then, folks decided it was better to forget. Said it saved trouble." He thumbed the spine of one of the notebooks like it was a living thing. "We told ourselves it was trauma, that kids make stories to explain what they feel." But Thomas's last entries stopped in a hurry. The handwriting became jagged, like someone trying to get away from the page. "They come at night." One line read. "They take more than I put back. I think they want names now." It read like a child discovering rules he hadn't been told. The last page was blank except for a single sentence in heavy, almost adult hand. "We hid it because it demanded payment." The idea of a debt that the town had been paying in secret made the floor under me tilt. I thought of the ring, of the ribbon, of the prints that came at night. What had the town given over the years to keep peace? What had winter asked for in return? Names? Time? The small trajectories of a life. The thought made my skin go thin. There was a notation in one margin that caught my eye. If you return what is lost, you do not lose what you are. Thomas had written it like someone trying to promise himself a bargain. But then he crossed it out. Underneath, in a different hand, someone had written, "Not always." I looked up at the sheriff. His jaw had the set of a man who has been carrying a ledger too long and is tired of the sums. When Thomas came back, he said quietly, he was different, quiet, older in ways that make no sense. He carried a handful of things from the town and would not speak about some nights. Parents were relieved. Teachers said he'd been through something and loved him back into the fold. The sheriff stopped, inhaled, exhaled, but some said he was hollowed, like pieces were missing, a look that never left. I thought of Mara at my porch, of the way she had asked, "Where is she?" as if my mother were a present someone had lent her. I thought of the children in Thomas's notebooks, who kept lists and left coins and ribbons like tiny prayers. The ledger suggested a bargain that had worked at a cost. The winter took one thing and returned another, but the return was imperfect. It bore silencings and strange morphings as evidence. What did it take? I asked, and my voice sounded small. The sheriff looked out the frosted window, watching the pines. "It takes what can be carried in the dark," he said finally. "Names, days, the parts of us we count on to be ourselves." He tapped the desk. We pretended we could decide which parts we'd sacrifice. His hand hovered over the notebooks, then flattened them. We were wrong. The truth landed like snow in the mouth, a flake you can taste but not warm into water. I felt the slow spread of something like shame. The town had been making ledger entries on its children's lives and calling it mercy. That night, I walked home with the notebooks folded under my arm. The wind moved the snow into little drifts like creases in paper. At my kitchen table, I spread Thomas's pages out like relics. The light from the lamp turned the ink into tiny, patient stars. I kept thinking of that crossed-out promise, of the line that read, "Not always." If a bargain had been struck, if the town had traded pieces of itself to keep the season calm, then Mara's return was not a miracle but a revision. She had come back bearing a ring and the look of someone who had been bargained with. The question that sat at the center of everything was no longer only who had taken and who had given, but whether a debt could be broken without further cost. Outside, through the window, the pines kept their steady watch. In the house, the ring in my pocket warmed against my thigh like a pulse. The notebooks whispered like old people on a porch, full of stories that ached to be told. I pressed my palm to them until they stilled, and felt, sharply, that we had been colluding with a winter that kept accounts we never asked to see. If we could stop the ledger, if we could refuse the payments it demanded, what would the winter do then? Would it take harder? Would it start asking for names we had not thought to fear? The question sat in the room like a second shadow, patient and waiting. At sunset, the trees look like silhouettes of people gathered to watch you make a choice. The light bleeds gold through the gaps and the pines throw long, patient fingers across the snow. Mara stood at the edge of those fingers, small against the wide sky, and for a moment she was nothing more than a silhouette to a cutout of a child waiting in a frame. She didn't move until I reached the clearing. Then she turned, slow and deliberate, as if she had been given permission to breathe. All week I'd been carrying things around. Notebooks with shaky ink, a ring that warmed like a pulse, a ribbon that smelled faintly of earth. They felt necessary and corrosive at once, the way truth can be. The town had been holding its breath for a long time. It had learned to answer hard things with small gestures, a lamp left on the porch checked at night, a polite nod to the sheriff when he passed. But those gestures haven't counted for the quiet that gathers at the edges of houses. They don't count for what moves in the spaces between roots. When I found Mara, she was still barefoot, the skin of her feet pale and patterned with tiny, pale scars. The sunset laid a thin orange veil across her face. Her hair looked darker where the light didn't touch it, and her hands were folded around something invisible. She had the look of someone who had been keeping a secret that was also a duty. We stood there mostly in silence, because silence felt like a courtesy, and because words felt insufficient. The earth at our feet held its own grammar, the compressed drifts, the little hollows where something had lain. The pattern of prints around my mother's grave had been smoothed by wind into a soft bruise, but I could still feel the impression in my mind like a map. I felt the ring heavy in my pocket, a weight that pulled at my hip like an unspoken obligation. "Mara," I said finally, the name making a small crack in the air. "You shouldn't be out here barefoot." She smiled, a small thing without triumph. "She doesn't like shoes," she said simply. "Says they make the wrong sound." Her voice was careful, as if she were repeating rules she'd been given. There was a steadiness to it that made my skin prickle. I thought about the notebooks and Thomas's handwriting, the lists and the crossings out. I thought about bargains made in the dark and the small rituals children are taught because adults prefer tidy answers over hard truths. Why did you bring the ring? I asked, because the question had followed me like a shadow. It felt like the last honest question to ask. Mara's hands tightened around themselves and she looked out toward the trees as if listening for a reply. She told me, then not in a rush, but like reading a line she had learned by heart. She showed me where it lived. She keeps things so they remember. She wanted it home. The words were plain, lacking flourish, and that made them worse in their logic. Simple statements have a way of anchoring the more ridiculous things we prefer to call lunacy. Mara turned her face to the sunset and squinted. In that light, her features looked older, not with age, but with a kind of knowledge that keeps children still. She spoke to me like you speak to your plants, she said. Soft, like she thought she was helping. She said I had to bring back what was lonely. The pines at the tree line shifted like a crowd leaning forward. I could almost imagine hearing something else there, a low, patient hum that was part wind and part voice. I felt the hair on my arms lift. All those little relics we'd found, the coin, the button, the photographs washed out by snow, stacked up in my head as proof of an economy I hadn't wanted to believe in. The ring in my pocket warmed until it was almost hot. Does she ask for anything else? I asked. My voice was careful. I wanted facts. I wanted rules I could follow or break. If there were rules, I'd rather know them than be left to guess. Mara looked down at her hands. Sometimes names, she said. Not always. Sometimes it's not names. Sometimes it takes days. She looked at me then, and for an instant the child and the something that had returned her overlapped. She said you cried when they lowered her, Mara added. She said you might know how to fix it. The sun thinned into a blade and the sky turned the color of old metal. The world felt compressed to the clearing and the line of trees. In that compression, a choice appeared, one I could feel like taut string, follow, or let go. The sheriff's notebooks whispered in the back of my mind, not always, crossed out, denied. The town's ledger with the payments it had made like small sacrifices on an altar it pretended not to own. I can't give her what she wants. I said finally, more to myself than to Mara. I don't know what she needs. I had a sudden, reckless urge to hand the ring back to fix the ledger with the same clumsy certainty of breaking a thing and hoping it reseals. My hands shook. I felt like a referee in a game whose rules had been written in another language. Mara stepped closer until the hem of her dress brushed my knee. She looked up at me, and the sunset lit her face in an honest, flat way. She said you'd understand, she repeated. She said you kept things because you thought it would help. There was a softness to the way she spoke my mother's name. Like the syllables were fragile objects she was careful not to drop. For the first time since all of this began, I felt a real, sharp anger, not toward Mara, but toward the neatness of the adults who had decided silence was shelter. I thought of Thomas and the notebooks. Of families who had closing ceremonies and then built a fence around what they'd buried. We covered it up, I said, the words small and unbelieving. We paid so we could sleep. Mara nodded, as if confirming a fact she already suspected. She said payments don't always keep things away. She said, they only change what comes back. Her eyes were steady and frightening in their clarity, but she said sometimes you can stop the list. Stop it how? I asked. The wind sighed through the pines like someone answering a question with a question. The clearing felt suddenly full of listeners. Mara reached into her pocket and took out a small, folded scrap of paper, the same paper I'd found by the tree, now crinkled from being kept. She smoothed it between her fingers and slid it into my hand. In my mother's handwriting, faded but legible, were the words I had not expected to see again. Forgive what the winter took. Bring her here. Say her name loud. My throat closed. For a moment I couldn't tell whether my mouth was moving of its own accord or whether the words belonged to the paper. The idea of standing in the clearing and saying my mother's name aloud, of offering a counterweight of loudness to a season that demanded quiet payment, felt like a sacrament and a gamble at once. The sunset bled away until the trees were black and the first stars pricked the sky like witnesses. Mara slid my hand into hers without asking. Her fingers were warm in a way that made the rest of me ache. If you come, she said. She listened. She said once someone remembers loudly, it whooshes the things back, it confuses them. I thought of the notebooks, and of the town's ledger, and of the neat excuses that had cost us more than anyone would tally. I thought of my mother, the Way she folded towels, the smell of her stew, the way she'd smoothed my hair when I cried. Saying her name into a clearing felt like breaking a rule and praying it held. I took a deep breath. The cold took the small hit of warmth from my lungs and turned it into a white that hung between the trunks. My name sounded like a small stone, dropped into a well as I said it aloud, and then I said my mother's name. The sound went up and seemed, for a second, to be answered by a far-off, patient rustle. Mara squeezed my hand. We stood there, two figures at the border of something ancient and practical, and waited for the return. The pines leaned in like an audience. The ring in my pocket felt lighter, or perhaps it was my heart. We could walk into the dark together. Into the tunnel she'd described, around the trees where the old bargains were kept. Or we could stand and call, loud enough to wake whatever had learned to keep accounts. Both choices felt like steps into unknown weather. I took another breath and listened. The clearing held its breath back. The world seemed to tilt toward me, waiting for the next sound. The sound I would make to end a ledger or begin another. The sun slipped fully away, and the first cold reached across my cheeks like a hand.